All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Nikki Davis. I'm the Chief of Staff to the Dean of the UW-Madison International Division, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 Lichtel Career Fair Keynote Address, sponsored by the UW-Madison Center for South Asia, the Institute for Regional and International Studies, and the Wisconsin Intensive Summer Language Institutes. For those of you who may not be familiar with UW-Madison's intensive summer language programs, Whistly offers high-quality, proficiency-driven courses in over 30 less commonly taught languages. Our virtual course options help ensure that these language courses are accessible to as many students as possible, both nationwide and globally. And this summer, more than 200 undergraduates, graduate students, and adult learners are studying 18 languages, ranging from Arabic and Bangla to Pashto, Portuguese, and Persian, all the way to Uzbek, Vietnamese, and Yoruba. Our 8-week programs are the equivalent of 1 year of language gains, so our dedicated students are currently earning 8 college credits for their hard work. Whistly is committed not only to our students' multilingual development, but their professional growth as well. Less commonly taught languages are not synonymous with less commonly used. Indeed, these languages are widely spoken and are critically important to international relations and the local communities whose cultures derive from the languages they speak. Each summer, Whistly welcomes leaders and experts from various sectors to share stories, advice, and opportunities for building multilingual professional lives. And this keynote address is just one example. We invite you to submit questions for our speaker via the Q&A feature at any point during the presentation, and we'll leave time after Dr. Randolph's remarks for a discussion moderated by my colleagues. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker. Dr. L.J. Randolph Jr. is an assistant professor of world language education and affiliate faculty in second language acquisition at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Before working in higher education, Dr. Randolph spent a decade as a Spanish and ESL teacher at the high school level. His research and teaching focus on various critical issues in language education, including teaching Spanish as a heritage home or community language, incorporating justice-centered, anti-racist, anti-colonial pedagogies, and centering Blackness and Indigenousness. He is a co-editor of the volume How We Take Action, Social Justice in Pre-K to 16 Classrooms, an advocate for abolitionist, liberationist, and transformative language education. He's held leadership roles in many professional language associations at the state and national level, including the 2024 president of ACTFL, originally founded as the American Council on Teaching of Foreign Languages. We are so very fortunate to have Dr. Randolph here today, and I am thrilled to turn the floor over to him now for his keynote address. Dr. Randolph, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nikki, and thanks everyone who's in attendance. It's been, wonderful to receive this invitation and to be here and to chat with some of you today and to share and to reflect and to dream and to grow with you and all of those things. So we get started here. I was looking at the attendee list and I noticed a lot of familiar names. And so it's great to see, I can't see your faces, but it's good to see some familiar names in the audience. So thank you for being here. The title of my presentation for today is Humans Who Language, Restoring Humanity to Language Education in Dehumanizing Times. And I know that maybe that sounds a little negative to say dehumanizing times, but I really hope that you'll see that the overall message of my talk today is a message of hope and transformation and empowerment. On the topic of humanity, I do want to say that I'm not trying to center myself as an expert, right? How could I? It's humanity. We're all humans. We all have experiences and perspectives that we bring to our humanity. So, like I said earlier, I hope that mostly you'll just reflect with me, think with me and dream with me a little bit and understand that I'm speaking about this from my perspectives that you'll hear a little bit more about in a second here. That is an educator, right? Of the many roles that I've had in my life, the one that's been consistent has been that of an educator and that of a learner. And so the first thing I want to do is I want to ask you, what words do you associate with humanity? When you think about humanity, what words come to mind? So so again, if I did my sharing right, hopefully you can see the some of the answers that have been coming in. I'm seeing words like kindness. Kindness is the most popular word so far. It's interesting. Empathy. I see language. Good, because this is a presentation about the humanity of languaging, so that's good. I see communication, relationships, connection. We'll come back to that word as well. That word connection. I see communities. I see humanness, literature, all the things that we create as humans, like literature, music, etc. Individuality, and I love that the word community is here, relationships as well as individuality, because it's about all of that. I see people, selflessness, education, dignity, thought, love, growing. I love that. So those are just some of the answers that people have come up with. I wanted you to think about it a little bit before I kind of share the way that I've been thinking about some of these things. And so, all right. So again, this isn't the correct answer. Like you, I was reflecting on this, and these are some of the things that I came up with. So I have here love. I saw that in the presentation. I saw language there, which is good. For me, I also think about liberation. I think about the stories and the histories of people and how that's often bound in our quest for liberation in various contexts. I think about all the intersections of identity, right? And how we're always on this quest to define who we are, and that is part of humanity as well. And then I also like to think about it in terms of nuance. Humanity is complicated, it's messy. A lot of times it doesn't make sense. And so that's important to keep in mind too as we delve into issues dealing with humanity. When we think about humanity, there'll be elements of it that won't make sense, right? Because we're complicated beings as humans. And so, as I mentioned, I'm an educator. And so, what are some of the implications of this in the classroom, right? I've often had students either tell me explicitly or indicate by some of their practices and actions in the classroom that, maybe they're bored, right? Or maybe they just don't want to learn whatever it is that we're doing in class that day. That's the reality of it, right? But I've never had a student say, I don't want to be successful, or I don't want to feel liberated, or I don't want to experience joy. So a lot of those emotions that you put on the slide about humanity, those are things also that we as humans naturally gravitate toward. And as a side note, I do teacher education. And so when I talk with my students about issues that they may be having in their student teaching experience when they're teaching various levels, pre-K through 12, and maybe they're having issues with discipline in the classroom or relationships with their students. And I always go back to the fundamentals of humanity. Like, what are you doing in your class, to the extent that it depends on you, to make sure that students are feeling successful, they're feeling joy, they're feeling liberated. And I'll say like 99% of the time, if I, as an educator, focus on those elements and think critically about ways that I can create space for students to feel that in my classroom, a lot of the other challenges associated with being an educator and having, 20 to 30 different students in a class, a lot of those issues work themselves out. And so I always think about how do we focus on humanity. This is a presentation about language, right? And the connection of language to humanity. And I have a quote here from linguist Noam Chomsky. Even if you're not a generative linguist, you may have heard of him. But he says language is the core component that defines human beings, meaning that other beings communicate, right? But in the way that we define language, only humans language. Um, In the introduction, Nikki mentioned that I'm the immediate past president of the organization ACTFL, which is an international organization for language education. And way back in, I think it was 2016 or 2017, ACTFL came out with a position statement about what is a world language. And so we're going to go through this position statement. I want you to think with me, what's the common theme that you see throughout all of these elements about what defines a world language, okay? So, human communication used for interaction and negotiation of meaning. Human communication, investigating, explaining, and reflecting the practices, products, and perspectives of another culture. Human communication to exchange information. Human communication to share stories. And finally, you guessed it, human communication in order to be immersed in a specific language community. Now, all of those bullet points started with the term human communication. Um, I'll try to monitor. Let me move this slide over here so I can see it. I'll try to monitor the Q&A. I want you to tell me, why do you think, I think this came out in early 2017, we worked on it in 2016, released in early 2017. Why would ACTFL release a statement in 2017 defining what a world language is and also focusing so much on the fact that it involves human communication? It's the one thing that appears in each of those bullets. Why do you think ACTFL did that? I'm looking at the Q&A. You can Yeah, like a lot of you got it, right? That was when we were having that debate about, well, does computer coding count as a language? And different language programs were trying to get rid of languages, in many cases, some of the less commonly taught languages, and replace that requirement with computer coding. And so our dialogue at the time was trying to help people understand that language in the way that we use languages is not the same as what a computer coder does. So thank you. And also, I have some of my favorite quotes about languaging. So first, I have Toni Morrison in two different spaces. She talks about how we do language as humans. First, she says that may be the measure of our lives, and then she says this is how civilizations heal. Um, Gloria Anzaldúa talks about, if you really want to hurt me, talk badly about my language. Ethnic identity is my twin skin to linguistic identity. I am my language. Until I can take pride in my language, I cannot take pride in myself. Um, and someone who specializes in what he called crypt linguistics, John Henner, said, your languaging is the story of your life. And with that in mind, I just want you to think. I don't want you to type in the chat, or we don't have another poll or anything for it. But I want you to think about, what is a personal or professional moment that reflects the humanity of languaging for you? When you think about how languaging connects to the things that make us human, what comes to mind? I personally have three things I want to share with you really quickly. I have three examples. The first deals with my daughter, Veda. My daughter she just turned 9 years old. And I remember when she was born, people would ask me, are you going to speak to her in Spanish? Are you going to, raise her bilingually? And I thought, oh yeah, that would be cool. And that was something that I wanted to do. And so I really did try. Like when she was born, I spoke to her only in Spanish. And I wanted her to grow up to be bilingual. But what happened was, first of all, I don't use Spanish within my family. No one in my family speaks Spanish. And so that was one way that it felt kind of awkward using it in that space all the time. Secondly, no one could understand, because of that, no one could understand me when I was talking to her in Spanish, right? So it would just be she and I communicating. And then the third element of that is it takes kids a long time before they start responding back to you, right? And so I remember thinking, wow, I don't think I can do this for like 3 years or however long it would take her to actually start responding. Like, me speaking to her completely in Spanish, no one else ever being able to understand it, right? And then also me not getting the affirmation or the feedback from her. So I ended up thinking I can't do this. I can't. It's just too unnatural for me to speak Spanish all the time in this context, this particular context. And so, but what I realized as time went on, Spanish was still something that was an integral component to our lives. And I have two examples of that. The first thing there you see on the left is a clip of us dancing to one of our favorite songs. And I need to mute it because I don't want this to get copyright tagged and when you post this on YouTube. So, but we're dancing to the song Volverte a Ver by Juanes. And that's one of her favorite songs. And it became one of her favorite songs. And we have so many memories from it just because of her listening to me and watching me listening to Spanish music all the time. And then in the part there to the left, I shared a story on like social media of when my daughter was saying, "Hey, I want to hear 'Give Me Now, Give Me Now.'" And for me, I'm immediately thinking about in English, what is she saying? And she's actually trying to say the word "criminal," which is a song that she really liked at the time that she wanted to hear. And so even though I didn't explicitly make an effort to teach Spanish, it still found a way, and their memories connected to Spanish throughout our lives. And that's just two examples of that expressing the humanity. The other thing I wanted to show you, this is the kanji in Japanese, one of the kanji symbols that represents the verb to listen, kikimasu. And what's interesting about this kanji, I'm learning Japanese, and one of my friends with whom I was practicing Japanese shared this with me. The word for to listen has all of these components, these four components. First is the ear, which is obvious, right? Then it has the plus sign, which is in kanji, that's 10. So it's like using your ear 10 times. Then there's the kanji for eye. So using your ear 10 times, then using your eye, and then also your heart. And all of that goes into what we define as listening. And so I thought that was really cool to see that in action. And that's just one example, again, of the humanity of language. And then I want to share a little bit about my language journey. One of my colleagues, Shanika Hankerson, who's in Maryland, and we recently wrote a piece looking at our shared histories as Black linguists. And it's funny that we had this sort of parallel existence within our language journeys, right? We each shared stories of linguistic oppression from our youth, which led to moments of questioning and critical reflection later on. Like we thought, hey, this isn't right that we're being discriminated because of our language in this way, but we don't quite know how to describe it. We don't have the language to really express our frustration and our anger and our disappointment at times. And it wasn't until we both became linguistics majors that we experienced this moment of awakening, this moment of discovery. And for both of us, that defining moment happened during our undergraduate years in college when we started taking linguistics classes. And so what's disappointing about that is I think about so many people from my community who don't have who didn't take sociolinguistic classes and who are probably still in that questioning and critical reflection stage of wondering why are things this way? Why does the linguistic discrimination happen in this way, right? But anyway, that discovery then led to a joy and a pride associated with our languaging practices that we really didn't feel and didn't embrace completely up until that point. And that awakening and joy gave us the confidence to push back against both individual and systemic linguistic oppression. And then that's what we do today. It's through that joy that we can have this continued resistance rooted in that joy. And we've been able to maintain that unwavering hope as we continue to engage in this work. And so with that, I want you to think about what would you describe as the beginning of your formal L2 plus learning experience? If you learned a second language in like a school or in some other context, what was it like? What was the beginning of that like? If you have an experience like that, where you learned an L2 in a school or some other type of formal context. And again, this is rhetorical. I just want you to reflect on it. Um, at here at UW-Madison, we have this course for our PhD program where all of the professors come and give a guest lecture in this introductory course in our PhD program. And that's so that students in our program can get to know who all the professors are, what our research interests are, et cetera. One thing that I like to do during that talk is I like to ask folks, what was it like for you whenever you were beginning your L2 plus learning experience, right? Because a lot of folks fall into that category. They started learning a language, maybe they didn't become fluent in it. And it's always interesting to see what they say. Now, some folks did say things like, oh, it was fun or it was interesting, right? But then there were folks, and these are by far the most common answers that said things like, I think about conjugations. I think about it being confusing, alienating, silencing, clinical, tokenistic, frustrating, impractical, boring, slow, grammar, sterile, lost, useless, repetitious, shameful, struggle, and memorization. Now, if I could see you face to face, I would ask you, raise your hand if any of this sounds appealing, right? If you're a student, if you want to be in a class like that, or if you're an educator, if you would want somebody to describe your class like that, right? How would that make you feel? And the 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 fact of the matter is that this is a common story of folks who study language in formal settings and maybe didn't end up becoming a language professional like many of you were thinking about, right? And so I think that that part of the humanity is important to keep in mind as well. And I also think about my own language learning experience at that stage as well. This is me in high school in North Carolina when I started taking a world language. I took Spanish in high school. Um, and I mean, I thought the class was fun, right? I became a Spanish professor, Spanish teacher, so I enjoyed it. But it also wasn't a space where I felt liberation or where I felt that I tapped into the full humanity of languaging. Definitely not. Um, I was a linguist at heart, and so whenever my teacher would give us, these long lists of vocabulary words to memorize, or whenever she would give us, these verbs and we had to conjugate them, I'm like, oh yeah, I love this. I like memorizing things. I like conjugating verbs, right? But as we all know, that's not the best way to learn a language, and probably also not the best way to show the humanizing elements of a language, even though I liked the class because I was a mini linguist in training and just didn't know it at the time. Um, and so I put this here not to center myself, but really to just remind us that we're talking about actual people. We're talking about human. These are not abstract concepts, right? We're talking about the experiences of people, and that matters. And so how did we get here? What are some ways that we have dehumanized language as a profession, right? And I think the first thing we need to do is just realize that this is not just an individual issue, it's a historical issue that's deeply embedded within our institutions. For example, in the book Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer says here, talking about, like, I would be speaking Potawatomi here if, if things were different, if history was different. But like many of the 350 indigenous languages of the Americas, Potawatomi is threatened, and I speak the language that you read, English. The powers of assimilation did their work as my chance of hearing that language, and yours too, was washed from the mouths of Indian children in government boarding schools where speaking your native tongue was forbidden, right? So historically, we've restricted people from using their community languages, right? Historically, We've restricted people from using English, even, right? This is from the North Carolina Slave Code. It says, whereas the teaching of slaves to read and write has a tendency to produce insurrection and rebellion, we certainly don't want that, right? We're going to punish you if you try to teach enslaved people to read um, and write in English. And in many ways, American descendants of enslaved people and other historically marginalized and oppressed groups continue to suffer linguistic discrimination because of their language practices. So historically, we've done that with people's home languages. We've done that with English. We've done that with world languages, right? This is Superintendent Otis Ashmore, I think superintendent of the Savannah, Georgia School District at the time, segregated school, said to Robert Wright when he was trying to teach the kids Latin, cut that Latin out and teach these boys to farm, right? So we've done that with world languages as well. And shout out to Tasha Austin for that, which is where I got that quote from her research, Labor, Leisure, and Languages. And so we've done this historically, and this is also an issue that we experience in contemporary times. So this is from a study by Uju Anya. These are not Uju Anya's words. This is somebody who is a participant in her study, a teacher speaking. And the teacher says we're ignoring Black students in class and also in the curriculum and materials. It's total invisibility. For example, maybe if we did something related to Black Lives Matter, some kind of reading or something like that, just something, anything, but we have nothing. And the people here in the program, they don't understand how this invisibility in the curriculum is is contributing to the Black students' attitude of their feeling like they're not connected to the class. And so we're still feeling the implications of this in contemporary context. And I see people in the chat highlighting other examples of how this happens, right? Um, and on the one hand, what I think is really cool is that this didn't stop people from languaging, right? Even though people tried to strip that away from us, that didn't stop us. I don't know if you're a fan of Jurassic Park, but I like that movie. And there's a new one that's out in theaters right now. But one of the taglines in many of those films is the phrase, life finds a way, right? And I like to think of this as language finds a way, right? Even in the midst of oppression, language finds a way. Um, for example, Adrian Rich says, this is the oppressor's language, talking about English, yet I need it to talk to you. And Bell Hooks talks about how we took English and made it our own by transforming the oppressor's language, making a culture of resistance. Black people created an intimate speech that could say far more than was permissible within the boundaries of standard English. We make our words a counter-hegemonic speech, liberating ourselves in language. Um, so how have we dehumanized language? I look here at this is from 10 years ago, back when ACTFL made that quote, 10 years ago. Should the language of computers replace foreign language in high school? Right? So that was a discussion that we were having back then. We were also having discussions about should some say computer coding is a foreign language. Um, and then when there was pushback against that, just a few years ago, people were like, okay, well, fine, we won't call them languages, but we'll still take away the language requirement. So, for example, in this headline, Michigan may loosen school language requirements in favor of computers or finance. And then there's headline after headline after headline about contemporary programs being cut in all languages, some of the less commonly taught languages, as well as languages that have traditionally been commonly taught in U.S. contexts. So over and over, even at flagship state universities. And one thing that's interesting is there's also this marriage of capitalism and colonialism when it comes to language. I guarantee you, if you look at most language program websites and you think about how how programs define what successful language learning looks like, what the purpose of a language looks like. Here's one example. I guarantee you, either at the top of the list or toward the top of the list, it'll mention something related to capitalism or globalism, right? Globalism. So here, the top 10 benefits of learning more than one language. The first one, improve your career and business. I won't say the organization that put this, but they should know better. Um, and so I think we're living in this context where we disproportionately value language education as it relates to capitalist pursuits, but not as much as it relates to humanistic pursuits. Um, and so, for example, this was something that went viral a few years ago. This is a guy who's in a deli in New York City, and he hears some people speaking in Spanish. And so, what is his response? Well, he decides to go off on this racist tirade, this xenophobic tirade. He doesn't even know that the people speaking the language are immigrants, not that it matters, but telling them, I'm going to call ICE. Why are you speaking English in the classroom? Why are you speaking, excuse me, why are you speaking Spanish in this context, right? And um, what's interesting, two things. First of all, this is New York City, so it shouldn't be odd of all places, right, to see people out speaking Spanish, right? That just shouldn't call your attention in any context, but especially in a big city like New York, for example. But you do a little bit more research about him, and you find out his name is Aaron. The internet does what the internet does, right? The internet finds out, hey, this guy's in this viral video. Who is he? Let's find who he is. Uh, so he has a law office in New York, and not only that, but his law office also advertises and promotes the fact that they're a multilingual law office, right? We speak all these languages, and so this is something that is rooted in colonial imperious language ideologies, right? Linking English to some sense of a shared national identity. And that's just a little bit of our current context. What I want you to do with me today is I want you to think about the classroom, something that we all have in common. Like I said, my background is a language teacher. That's something that I always think about, what happens in the classroom. Bell Hooks talks about the classroom as being a place of possibility, right? So I want us to think about what can we do to center humanity and maybe shift the status quo a little bit. So, first, as a profession, those of you who are language educators or are connected with the language education profession, you might recognize this, right? The 5 C's framework. This is probably in US context the most ubiquitous framework for thinking about language education. So big picture, we think about language as being more than just communication, right? It's cultures, it's connections, it's comparisons, it's communities. But there's some problems with this framework. And I feel like since I've been a past president of ACTFL, I can be a little bit critical here, right? There are many things that I like about this framework, but it comes with some problems. So let's look at one of those problems. Let's just look at the connection standard of the 5 C's. We'll just look at that one. So in I just did this project where I looked at all of the state standards, which are all of them are based off of the 5 C's. If a state has state language standards, to some extent, it's based off of the ACTFL 5 C's framework that you just saw. And so the word connection is mentioned approximately 1,500 times. Also, interesting, connections was mentioned as an element of humanity in the activity we did at the beginning of this presentation. So you saw that there. So it's mentioned 1,500 times. These are the contexts that we talk about connections in the standards, though. Globalization, right? So there's that competitive, capitalist perspective again, being able to make contacts all over the world so you can get better jobs, make more money, that kind of thing. Um, Competence, like this idea of connecting and relating with others in a culturally competent manner. And then I think the word competence comes with a little bit of baggage. That's for another presentation, though. Connecting meaning and structure. So looking at the language itself and thinking about how do we connect different forms to structures and to meaning in the language. And then also recognizing that language learning is interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. So thinking about how do I incorporate what students do in a math class, for example, in my French class or whatever the class might be. The problem is, if you look at the way that connections is used outside of that context, outside of the context of schooling, right? People are talking about building solidarity. It's used as a way to connect in order to achieve justice-centered goals. And so I thought about how do I bring that into the classroom? I'll show you one example of that. My previous institution was the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. You may not know this, but in 1898, Wilmington was the site of the was known as the only successful coup d'etat in American history, right? And so there was this massacre where prominent Black folks in Wilmington lost their legacy, their homes, their businesses, and their lives. Um, and so, what the community has done to try to repair that in some way, you can see here, I'm at a monument on our campus relating to Black Lives Matter. That was commissioned by the university for a local artist in our state, and that's on campus. I think it's still there, actually. I hope so. The Black Lives Matter, silence equals violence. I know that's not there anymore, right? I feel like in this context of pushing against anything that's DEI related, institutions almost have their finger on the delete key. And as soon as it became difficult to talk about any of this, they're like, okay, we're getting rid of all this stuff, right? Thank goodness we don't have to think about it anymore, right? They were almost too quick to dismantle their DEI programs. And so we see that in lots of institutions, and frankly, UW-Madison included, right? Um, and then in the lower right-hand corner, you see the name of a park. It's called Hugh McCrae Park, or it was called that. And Hugh McCrae was one of the conspirators of the 1898 massacre in Wilmington. And, he was able to amass all this wealth that he stole from the legacies of Black folks. And it's interesting that there's so many things named after the McCrae family in Wilmington. And I grew up there. I am from Wilmington originally, and I didn't learn about this until I was in graduate school, right? And I was right there in the community playing in that park. And so there was this whole movement within that community and different populations to rename things in our community to not honor discriminatory and violent legacies. Um, and then this happens all over the world. Here are photos of Black Lives Matter protests in New York. That's the one in the upper left-hand corner in Spanish. That's in New York. There's one in Korea and one in Brazil. And so I give my students the language to talk about this in class, to talk about it in Spanish. And then we think about how do we create some humanistic outcomes? So if I just use the curricular documents that are available to me, the can-do statements are what they're called. This is what I get. In my own and other cultures, I can identify familiar landmarks and monuments and what they represent. So the standards were not written from a humanistic perspective. Remember, they're written from this perspective of performance, of capitalism, coloniality. So I need to expand that. So this is just something that I do in my own classes. I think about even in my learning outcomes, how do I make them more humanistic? So not only can they identify them, but they can also talk about how these representations impact racial justice and community identity, and what are the histories and perspectives they bring with them. So instead of just identifying some of the artists and their styles and contributions, like the artist who constructed that monument I showed you earlier, we talk about how their diverse racial and cultural backgrounds influence their styles and contributions, right? And how that's shaped by their own identity as well as broader movements towards social justice. Instead of identifying and celebrating holidays and festivals, which is the standard that you'll find in our national standards document, I think about how do we expand that, right? Um, how do we identify how communities build solidarity through collective action against racial injustice? So I think I have three broad recommendations here that I think work in various contexts, and the examples that I'll share with you are my own context, which is the teaching of Spanish. So the first one is how do we center humanistic epistemologies? Winona LaDuke talks about food. She says, whether they have wings or fins or roots, and indeed that is how we consider food, Food is our relatives. Food has a culture. It has a history. It has a story. Food is more than something you just buy at the store. So here's something that I collaborated with the middle school teacher to do. This is a middle school class, a Spanish class. So the first thing that they did is look at what are some words that we get from these indigenous cultures relating to everyday items. So these are words in Nahuatl, Quechua, and Taino that students may recognize. And if you're having trouble with this, spoiler alert, everything is in order. So they correspond in order to what you see on the screen. Then we take that a step further and look at an article talking about how some activists are trying to reclaim and revitalize their language, right? So this article relates to the Raizal community, which is a Black Colombian ethnic community in San Andres and Providencia, which is one of the they call them departments, but it's like a like a state or district of Colombia. It's located in the Caribbean. And the quotes there says about the Raizal language, I'm almost a museum piece. My language and culture are in danger of extinction. Our languages don't die, they are killed. Remember, this is a middle school class, novice level. We don't show them the whole article. We just pull out quotes, right, that we can use as a springboard for conversation in the class. Um, and then here's what the poem looks like. And I'll just play a little bit of it so that you can hear the Raizal.
Vida the parsley, vida the marjan, vida the black pepper, vida the sorrel, vida the mint tea, vida the...
Okay. And so with that, you can hear the person saying, I am all of these things, plants, natural drinks, food, spices. This is who I am. And you think about what a novice level student is learning. They're learning the word to express I am, soy, I am, to be in Spanish. So students at this level, what I had them do is write a similar poem linking their identity and sense of place to the natural world so that we're talking about these things in a more humanistic way and not just superficially or as they relate to capitalism or business. Another thing that we can do is reject capitalist learning outcomes. A lot of the language that we see in standards talks about actions and performance, and anything outside of that is not really valued. If you look at a methods textbook, for example, it'll tell you that if an objective isn't observable and if you can't assess it, if you can't perform it, it's not really a real objective, right? There are methods textbooks that tell students this as they're learning how to teach a language. And so I like to think it doesn't have to be this way, right? So I push back against that and I use humanistic language. Like I can love myself. I can care about the oppression of other people. I can feel joy in this particular context. And we won't see these can-do statements in the world readiness standards, the standards that I showed you earlier, because they're not observable. However, they're humanistic and they relate to the reasons why we learn language. I'll show you a quick example of this. This is from a novice class at the elementary level. So I don't know if we have any elementary teachers in the audience today, but this is for you because I think a lot of times we push those folks aside. We don't think about them. So in this poem, this is called Pensamiento Serpentino, which means like winding thoughts. And it helps students develop an early sense of community and mutual care and mutual empathy early in their language learning journey, right? So it's all about how do we love and care for one another. And here's a quote from the poem that says, to be Chicano is to love yourself, your culture, your language, your skin. So this is just as students are answering the question, ¿Cómo te llamas? They also learn to answer the question, ¿Cómo te amas? Right? How do you love yourself? And that's part of the objectives that we put into the curriculum so that it's not just about language proficiency, it's also about our development and our understanding of humanity. And the final thing that I'll say is embrace the nuances of languaging and identity. In our standards and the way that we talk about languages, we often like to use very general terms like diversity and cultures. And it's funny because when I first started thinking about this, and one of the pieces that I recently wrote about it, diversity was like a safe word, but now even diversity is a pejorative, right? My critique back then was, oh, diversity doesn't really say much. You know, you need to get deeper than that. And now, you know, the goalpost has moved, and even diversity has become one of those terms that we can't use, which is unfortunate because I'm like, it didn't mean anything in the first place. And so, how do we focus on specific language that names racism, that names discrimination, and that foster critical reflection and liberating and transformative education? I have an example for that, but because I took a little bit of time to get started here, and we had that little snafu with transitioning screens and getting the poll started, I'll skip my example, but I'll share these slides so that you'll be able to click through it and listen to it. But there are two poems here. One is called Dear White Girls in My Spanish Class, and the other is called Afro Latina. And here, two Black women are just talking about how they enter the space of a language class and be how they are Spanish learners in that environment and what perspectives they bring with them and how that impacts the way they view language and the way that they language within that space. Um, One thing that I'll say is I was talking, this was at another institution, and I shared it was a talk about social justice. And I was talking about here are some of the things that have worked with my class and my students and the way I've collaborated with other folks. And one of the people said, you know, LJ, that's so great, but this can't work in my class. It's easy for you to do because you teach Spanish. And they're like immediate communities of Spanish are around that you can incorporate this stuff into, but this won't work with the language I teach. And so I asked him, well, what language do you teach? And he said, I teach Arabic. And I said, well, that's interesting because I know of lots of communities within the United States that are Arab speaking. And then also, like in terms of thinking about humanity, there are issues that are current, that are happening in the world, in the Arab speaking world, where we're questioning what it means to be human, right? So you can easily talk about this in your class and develop lessons about that. And when I said this, the person said, oh, there's no way I'm talking about Palestine in my class. There's just no way. I'm not doing that at all. And I thought that was unfortunate because it made me think of the words of Shamari Reed, who has a book called Humans Who Teach. And he says, we can choose to engage, or we can give in to fear. And if we choose not to interrupt, too many students will suffer. And so I say this just to say that there are consequences when we leave certain narratives out of what it means to language, right? And so I skip that part, and I just want to end by saying my main takeaway from all of this is just to lead with humanity, and the rest will fall into place. So no matter what your career path may be, you know, if you find yourself in the classroom as a teacher, if you find yourself working for a government agency, if you find yourself working for a company where you use your language skills, wherever, or even when it comes to setting your own goals as a language learner. Some of you are just learning the language for fun. I think that's wonderful, right? But I want you to think, what does it mean to lead with humanity in that context? And understand that it's not a natural process. It's not something that just happens as we study languages or as we teach languages. It has to be done intentionally, right? And it involves pushing back against the status quo. And so at lots of times there's a certain level of discomfort involved. And so how are we then centering language and centering humanity as we language? How are we centering compassion as we language? And I mean that for both ourselves, our own sense of humanity, as well as the humanity of others. And so I apologize for ending right at 4 o'clock, but I did want to say that I can stick around for about 10 minutes or so if people have questions or if you want to unpack something of what I said. And like I said, I'll make sure that I get these slides to whoever posts this to the website so that you can carefully go through some of those examples that I went through a little bit quickly here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Randolph, for such a thoughtful, engaging, and thought-provoking keynote. And thanks to everyone who joined for following along, the comments in the chat. This was a wonderful dialogue, and I appreciate you all so much for your time today. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.